So let's get started. So a few announcements as we're starting up. Homework 1 has been put out on Moodle about Friday. So usually homeworks are due in 1 week, so it's going to be due this coming Friday. Okay, take a look at it, and it needs to be turned in via Moodle. I think I mentioned this in the very first lecture, but some of you may not have picked up on it. Everything comes in through Moodle. You don't have to turn in hard copies of your homework or lab assignments. Code is turned in through Moodle. Homeworks are turned in through Moodle. Okay, so you'll submit your homework through Moodle. Okay, so keep that in mind. The first lab will be out soon, hopefully today itself, and I can talk about it tomorrow. Okay, labs are usually due in about 2.5 weeks. Okay. So I'm going to continue our discussion from last Friday. Friday we had a makeup class. I started this topic of virtualization. We've been talking about what virtualization is and different types of virtualization. Specifically, we've been talking about hardware virtualization. I introduced type 1 hypervisors, which are bare metal hypervisors for implementing virtual machines, and type 2 hypervisors, which actually run on a host operating system and they run another OS inside them. Okay? I showed you some details of how type 1 hypervisor works. Basically, there's a picture here which shows you how things work. So you have your hardware, your type 1 hypervisor runs on hardware. It's essentially replacing what an OS kernel would do, but this is now the virtualization layer. Okay, virtual machines run on top of the type 1 hypervisor. This figure shows you one of them. There's an OS that actually runs inside the virtual machine, which we call the guest OS. Okay. Now, from a guest OS's perspective, it looks like it is actually running on real hardware, but it's running on a virtualization layer. So the OS typically has full control of the hardware. In this case, it doesn't, because the hypervisor is controlling access to underlying hardware resources. So whenever the guest tries to perform any privileged instruction or task that requires hardware access, it will not be allowed to do so directly because it's under the control of the hypervisor. Instead, the guest OS will trigger a trap, which is like an interrupt. That interrupt goes into the type 1 hypervisor. The hypervisor will perform that task on behalf of the guest. Okay? So the guest OS doesn't directly talk to the underlying hardware or manage the underlying hardware. It does through the virtualization. That's the thing to keep in mind. Okay? So that is type 1 hypervisor. Will continue from that point on and talk about what we call type 2 hypervisors, which are essentially what you may have seen if you have run a virtual machine on VirtualBox or VMware Workstation on or Parallels. That's called type 2 hypervisors. Okay? So in this case, you boot your regular operating system on your machine. Okay? It could be Windows, Mac, Linux, and you construct a virtual machine in user space. Okay? So the virtualization layer, which is a type 2 hypervisor, essentially runs like a user application. You can create virtual machines, and then you can boot up those virtual machines. Okay? So in this case, the guest will actually run in the virtual machine on top of a type 2 hypervisor. Okay? Now notice in this case that unlike the bare metal, the type 2 hypervisor doesn't directly control access to underlying resources. Okay? In this case, it is the host operating system that is privileged. Okay? The type 2 hypervisor is simply running on top of another operating system, unlike in the bare metal case. Okay? And then the guest OS actually runs inside the virtual machine. Again, for the guest OS, it looks like it's running on real hardware, but it's running inside a virtual machine. It's not running on real hardware. Okay? So then the question is, what should happen in this case if the guest OS actually goes and tries to perform some privileged operation? How should it work? Okay, so in this case, when an OS performed a privileged operation, it caused an interrupt because the OS is not allowed direct access to the hardware. You go to the hypervisor performs that privileged operation for you. In this case, your two layers between the guest OS and the hardware. There's the type 2 hypervisor, there's the host operating system. Okay, so that technique is no longer going to work here. Okay, so you need a different set of techniques, and I'll talk a little bit about that here. So what is going to happen in this case is something different from how type 1 hypervisors are implemented. Essentially, this is what happens in VMware. Similar ideas hold in other types of type 2 hypervisors. So what happens in VMware is, as the OS code is loaded into memory and as it runs, the virtualization layer, which is in this case VMware, is going to scan the code for the OS. Okay? And it scans for what are called basic blocks within the OS code. And every time it sees in that code any sensitive instruction, any instruction that tries to perform any privileged operation, it is going to dynamically replace it with a procedure call, okay, into the hypervisor. Okay. In the previous case, you basically had a trap that went into the hypervisor. Here, the trap is no longer going to work because we are not operating at that level. So what's happening is you have what's called binary translation. It's on-the-fly translation of the code of the operating system. Okay, you are actually scanning the code as the code is executing. Every time you see a sensitive instruction, you replace it with a function call. Okay, so when the OS actually executes, it's not going to execute the original instruction. It's going to execute the translated call. That call is going to go into the hypervisor and tell the hypervisor what the OS needed to do. The hypervisor will then actually make a system call to the underlying OS to make the necessary calls to the OS. Okay, so 2 levels. So the hypervisor is going to scan the guest code. Every time it sees any sensitive instruction, that's replaced with the function call. When the OS executes the function call, it goes to the hypervisor. Okay, the hypervisor itself doesn't have the privileges like it had here, so it still cannot perform the operation. But the hypervisor will then make a system call. The code for the hypervisor will be written so that it makes a system call to the underlying OS. OS will then perform the necessary tasks on behalf of the hypervisor and the guest OS. Okay, so this is a different technique to implement virtualization. Okay, so essentially this requires you to have an efficient binary translation layer and a cache so that this is not going to slow things down. You are doing runtime translation. Okay, so you don't want this to slow down the performance of the underlying, not the underlying, but the encompassed guest operating system or its application. So this has to be implemented efficiently, and there are lots of tricks that you can use from runtime systems, programming languages that include caching and prefetching and doing translation ahead of time and whatnot. Okay? Any questions about this? Okay, so now it goes without saying that because you're doing this translation, you don't need any specific hardware support which you needed in type 1 virtualization. You needed specific support from the CPU so that whenever you performed any sensitive operation, you triggered a trap which caused you to go into the hypervisor. Here you no longer need anything like that, which allows you to run your type 2 hypervisor on any CPUs that will actually have the same instruction set. You don't need any specific support like VT support that I was talking about. VT stands for virtualization technology. Okay? Alright, so I'm going to quickly show type 2 hypervisor. For those of you who have used VirtualBox or anything like that, this will be clear what is going on. So this is VMware's workstation type 2 hypervisor on Macs. It's called Fusion. Okay, so this is the this is a GUI for the virtualization layer. I have 2 virtual machines here. There's Ubuntu and Ubuntu server. Okay, so I can I'm not going to show you how to create a virtual machine, but I'm just going to show you what happens when you run it. So I'm going to restart this VM. It's going to restart my Linux virtual machine, which is obviously running on my Mac here. You will see that, okay, so now it has started up. It will be a little slow, but nevertheless, it will do what we want it to do. So I will start terminal. So now this virtual machine is running Ubuntu Linux on a hypervisor which is itself running on the Mac. So Mac OS X is the host operating system. There's a virtualization layer which is VMware, and inside there is Linux running. Okay, so now you can look at various things. You can just do whatever you do on a Linux machine, is full-fledged Linux running here. And then you can see, for example, how the networking part of it works. So if you look inside here, so you will see that it has a logical interface which is Ethernet interface. It has its own internal IP address which is 192.168.2.130. Now that's not a real Ethernet card, it's an emulated card. An emulated card is actually going to be mapped onto the physical, in this case either the Wi-Fi card or an Ethernet card, for example. Okay? So you have emulations of devices. So this is an emulated Ethernet device. It's a logical Ethernet card, not a physical card. And the logical card is actually placed on a physical card. And if you look at the native machine, okay, so this is my Mac's terminal. If you look here, for example, you will see that there are underlying mappings. So this has its own Ethernet card here, which has a real IP address 128.119.245.24. That's the actual native card on the machine. And then you will see that what VMware has done on the native OS is it's created some more logical interfaces here. So you'll see VMNet 1 and VMNet 2. So those are actually logical interfaces that are mapped from the virtual machine onto the underlying physical interface. These are not additional cards that have got implemented. They're simply bridges that bridge the card inside the virtual machine to the Ethernet on the physical machine. So any packet that's sent from the virtual machine is directly actually sent on the physical interface. So essentially you have emulated devices is the thing to keep in mind. There's an emulated CPU that's going to emulate the instruction set, which is implemented using the physical CPU. There's an emulated disk that's implemented using the physical disk. There's an emulated network card that's going to be implemented using the physical network card. Okay, both OS type 2 and type 1 hypervisors emulate devices that are mapped onto physical devices. Okay, same is true on a type 1 hypervisor. It's just to give you some sense of how virtualization technology works. And you can start. This virtual machine looks like a physical machine. You can start it, you can reboot it, you can pause it, you can power cycle it exactly the way you do a physical device, but everything is emulated. If you power cycle your virtual machine, you don't power cycle the physical machine. It just looks to the OS inside as if somebody has pressed the power button on a physical PC to do the same thing, okay, but in an emulated environment. Any questions here? Shut this down and go back and continue. So that's type 2 hypervisors. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about para-virtualization. Okay, para-virtualization is like bare metal hypervisors. It's a type of type 1 hypervisors, but it doesn't need any hardware support. Okay? As I said, if you actually needed to implement a type 1 hypervisor, you need some functionality by which the guest operating system can trap to the hypervisor. For that, you need hardware level support at the CPU level, okay, in order to implement this. But what if the CPU doesn't have that kind of support? How would you go about implementing type 1 hypervisor? In this case, you cannot run your operating system code unmodified. You have to actually go and modify the code and implement some additional functions similar to what type 2 hypervisors do. Okay? Specifically, what you would need to do is you would actually, for example, let's say you have Linux as your guest OS, you would have to go and look at the Linux code and look for every occurrence of a sensitive instruction in Linux code. Okay? And you replace that sensitive instruction with actually a function call into the type 1 hypervisor. These are called hypercalls. Okay? Just as in operating systems, you have system calls, for hypervisors, you have hypercalls. Okay? So every sensitive instruction inside the virtual machine, inside the OS kernel is going to be replaced by a hypercall. So you no longer need the trap functionality at the hardware level. When your OS code runs, every time it needs to perform the operation, somebody has actually re-implemented that operation using a hypercall. So you will execute the hypercall. The hypercall will actually go into the type 1 hypervisor and ask the type 1 hypervisor to perform that operation on behalf of the OS. Okay? This is exactly what was happening in type 2 except at runtime. In type 2 hypervisors, this exact function was implemented at runtime where you're scanning the code and on the fly replacing instructions with procedure calls. If you do that offline, you actually change the actual source code, not do a binary translation, you can actually change the source code of the OS and recompile the kernel. So you have a modified kernel that's designed for type 1 virtualization. You get what is referred to as para-virtualization. Okay? So here, as you can imagine, you don't have to do binary translation. You have just made this code, this programmer has gone and made these changes, you compile the kernel, so there should not be any performance penalty of doing binary translation. So this was going to be more efficient if implemented this way. Okay? So in either case, the operating system that runs in the VM is not allowed to do privileged operating. Somehow the hypervisor has to do it for the OS. Okay? So in one case you do this by at runtime, in another case you do this by changing the code. Any questions on this? Okay, so there are again examples of para-virtualization technologies or virtualization layers. There's a virtual machine technology called Zen, which is implemented in Linux, which introduced this notion of para-virtualization. VMware had its own hypervisor that also implemented para-virtualization. Okay, the disadvantage of para-virtualization is you can only run kernels that have been modified to take advantage of it. Okay? So if you want to run Windows in para-virtualized mode, you are at the mercy of the vendor, in this case Microsoft, to provide you a kernel that is para-virtualized. Otherwise you can't do this. Everything else you've seen so far, you don't make any changes to the OS or the application. They just run unmodified. They just look like they're running on hardware, but they're running on emulated virtual machines. Is that clear? So I'm going to talk a little bit about other resources. We talked mostly about CPU and how you have to deal with sensitive instructions and so on. But every resource on your machine has to be virtualized for a virtual machine. Okay? That includes memory, that includes I/O, that includes the network card. I showed you a little bit about the network card in that VMware Fusion virtual machine that I was just showing. Same has to be done for memory. Okay, so what will happen when you have a virtual machine environment is you have RAM on your machine. Okay? You will have portions of that RAM partitioned and allocated to virtual machines. Okay, so if you have, let's say, 16 gig, you may say 4 gigabytes are allocated to a certain virtual machine. That virtual machine can only access that 4 gigabytes of RAM. It cannot access anything else on that physical machine. Okay, first you have partitioned your RAM. Okay? But not only have you partitioned, you also have to add additional functionality to modify page tables and so on. Okay, when the OS runs, it will take its allocated RAM and it will allocate them to processes inside that virtual machine. Okay, so let's say you have Linux running in your VM. Linux will have processes. Each process will be allocated pages and so on, for which you will need to maintain page tables inside the virtual machine. Okay? Now, modifying page tables is a privileged operation. Okay? It's something that requires you to modify registers in hardware, and guest OS cannot directly modify those page tables. You will need hypervisor support to modify page tables, for example. So whenever you need to create a new page table or you need to modify mappings of a page table, you will need to trap to the hypervisor. Okay? You'll have to ask the hypervisor to make those modifications. Hypervisors may have additional support such as shadow page tables, where for every page table inside the OS, you have a shadow page table that you're which is a mirrored page table that's being maintained in the hypervisor that has the same mapping, so that the hypervisor can track what is going on, for example. Okay? So you need some additional support in addition to just taking memory and partitioning it. You need additional support from the hypervisor in order to change memory management, page tables and whatnot. Okay? That's the thing to keep in mind. Okay? So you will need to, so the way this is actually implemented is you can make the page tables read-only, and whenever the OS tries to modify it, it looks like you're modifying a read-only entry. It's going to trap to the hypervisor. The hypervisor is going to actually make desired modifications and go back to the OS. Okay, this is one way you can implement it. It's sort of a hack, but that's a way to track to the hypervisor. About I/O virtualization as well, and then we'll see some other types of virtualization such as OS level virtualization. Okay, so this is how the disk on your machine is virtualized and made available to virtual machines. Okay. Each virtual machine stores its data in a large file called an image. Okay, that's called a virtual machine image or a virtual machine disk. It doesn't have to be one large file, it could be a set of files. If you've used any of these techniques to virtualize, you may have heard of VMDK files and things like that. Those are virtual disk files. Okay. So those essentially allow you to store data for the OS and the application that runs inside the virtual machine onto a physical disk. Okay. So you could basically construct a virtual disk. Okay. A virtual disk is essentially a large file and you store it on the physical disk. Okay. This virtual disk is then mounted inside the virtual machine. So as far as the VM is concerned, this large file appears as a real disk to it. Okay. Even though it's actually a file in the underlying host operating system. Okay, so that's one thing. So essentially, you have, let's say, this will be the small picture here. This is your physical disk. Okay. The VM's data and the OS data and apps are stored in essentially a virtual disk file. Okay. That's a file on the file system on this disk. Okay, and here's a VM. So this file is essentially mounted inside the VM. So inside the VM, this file appears as a logical disk. Okay, it looks like a disk. Okay, you can read and write to this disk just as you would read and write to the physical disk, except that when you read and write to this disk, so here is your OS. What is actually happening is you're reading and writing to a file on the native machine. Okay, but inside the virtual machine, this just appears to be a disk. It's a logical disk or an emulated disk. Okay, is that clear? What is actually going on? So you could do this. There are other ways to virtualize your disk. You could have simply taken your disk and created a partition. Okay, so this could have been, instead of a virtual disk file, you can make a partition and make the partition available to your VM. That's another way to virtualize the disk. Okay? I'll use less often, but also nevertheless available in certain virtual machine platforms. Okay? In either case, you have to allocate the storage. Okay, in this case, the storage is allocated through a large file, or you can allocate storage by creating a dedicated partition and making it available to the virtual machine. Okay. Inside the VM, the storage space appears like its own disk, okay, and you can only access data within that container, but not outside. You can't access other files and so on, unless they're specifically made available. Okay. So that's typically how storage on the disk is treated from a virtual machine's perspective. Okay, you may also partition the bandwidth on the disk, which is when I/O requests come in, there may be multiple virtual machine. You can take the bandwidth on the disk and also partition it across virtual machine. But certainly you have to at least partition the storage on the underlying disk across virtual machines. Okay, so is that clear? I don't know if anybody is understanding this, or it's just so simple that I don't need to explain too much. Yes, question.
So first you said the way you store things, and if actually we are creating files in the virtual machine and saving it, so basically the actual physical disk, there will be some memory which is within the virtual machine. Now the way it is stored is the same. The way this access will be, the performance will be more over here, the number of calls will be more over here.
Yes.
Why have virtual disk at the first time?
Okay, so you are asking how is the mapping working and why have virtual. So first thing is, virtual disk is a good abstraction because all the data of this VM is a one large file. Okay, you can move it around, you can copy it and so on, which is why you have this abstraction. Now you are asking how things are accessed. So at the host level, inside, let's say on your Mac, this looks like one gigantic file. This could be, let's say, a 10 GB file. Okay, that's been also, you have allocated 10 GB of space to this virtual machine. Okay. Now inside the virtual machine, this entire file looks like a full disk, which is about 10 GB in size. Now inside this disk, you can create actual files as far as this OS is concerned and this application is concerned. Those files are actually going to be stored as blocks within these larger files. Okay? So in an application here accesses a file. Okay? That file access is going to get translated into accessing some part of this virtual disk file. Okay? So you have to have this mapping because this entire virtual disk file appears as a real disk inside the VM. Okay? Inside this real disk is a file system where you're going to store lots of files. Okay? When you access any of those files, okay, what is going to happen is you're going to translate that into actually accessing portions of this larger file. Okay? That's how the virtualization is going to work. It is going to impose a performance penalty because there is a file system that's running on this virtual disk, which is actually accessing blocks of a file which lives on a native file system. So there is going to be a penalty to perform this translation, but it provides easy access to data inside the virtual machine. Yes.
So in the meeting for virtual disk is allocated for continuous, is it?
Okay. Question is when data storage is allocated to this virtual disk, is it contiguous? That depends on the underlying file system here. Okay? It doesn't have to be. Although this is like asking are blocks of a file stored contiguously on disk. It's completely up to the operating system or the file system. Okay, so you can actually have blocks of the file scattered all across the real disk. That may be actually the case even in this case. You create a 10 GB file, virtual disk file. It is unlikely you have 10 GB of contiguous space. So this virtual disk file, you are asking how is it laid out. So you have disk, so you may actually have blocks of this virtual disk file scattered all over the disk. Okay? That is going to add additional performance penalty because you are not going to get contiguous access and so on. Okay? But that's how it will work, and you will have to pay that price. If you had a partition, this would not be the case because that partition is contiguous on the underlying disk. Okay, so but if you have a file, you can't require that the blocks of the file be stored contiguously on disk. It doesn't matter that it's a virtual disk file. That's true for any file. Okay, that's up to the file system. This question.
Does that mean that partitioning will be more efficient?
Does that mean partitioning will be more efficient? Partitioning will indeed be efficient because if you have a disk partition, you don't have to go through a second file system because now you can see that there is one file system here. Okay? That's your native OS, that's your disk. That's your disk on your machine. There are two file system layers to go through. If you have disk partition here, this file system is directly accessing that partition. You have basically eliminated one layer of software and we're sitting in between. Okay, but then you have to do more things at the OS level. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, we will have some sort of a simple homework assignment that you'll go and play with some of these things just to get some familiarity with it. That's going to come after homework one, which is out right now. Okay, so watch out for that. Okay, so one last concept to keep in mind is this notion of a virtual machine appliance. What is an appliance? Is essentially a virtual machine disk image that contains some packaged OS and application. Okay, this is one way by which certain software is getting distributed. Okay. Rather than giving you a CD saying here is the application, go install it on your OS, then go configure your OS to use the application, which may be complicated when you have large distributed applications. One way by which these applications are being distributed is you create a virtual machine. You install some OS in there. You install all the applications you want to configure them, okay, and then you take this entire virtual machine disk and you send that to your customers. Now your virtual application is basically pre-configured on that virtual machine disk. All you need to do is start that virtual machine and start the application. You don't need to do configuration. You don't need to do installation of the app. You just need to get the virtual machine disk image and execute it. Okay, this is one way by which you can distribute pre-configured applications. Okay, such kinds of virtual disks are called appliances, okay, because you can just run the virtual appliances, not appliances themselves. So they are pre-configured. We have with OS and applications pre-installed. Okay, they simplify the task of configuring large complex applications. Okay. That's one use of how virtual machines are used, one way by which software is distributed. Another use for virtual machine is what I had mentioned at the very beginning. You can take a large server which may have lots of cores and you can partition that server machine into smaller virtual machine and assign some subset of the resources, some number of cores, some amount of RAM, some amount of disk to each virtual machine. Okay? So now one server is running, let's say, n smaller virtual servers. Okay, so this is often another use case. If you see server environments or data center environments, this use of virtualization is very common. You run a type 1 hypervisor. Okay, you may have a 16 or a 32 core machine. You will rarely have applications that use all of those resources. In most cases, the application will use some fraction of those resources. So what's a better bet is you construct smaller virtual machines using your type 1 hypervisor, run an OS inside each virtual machine, and run an application on that on top of that OS. Okay? So that's a typical use case. What also happens in this scenario is this is also used for what is called server consolidation. Okay. Let's say you have some aging servers. Let's say you have 10 servers that are maybe 5 years old. You want to replace them. Okay. When you bought these servers, maybe each of them was single processor or 2 processors, because that's what was state of the art when you bought them. Okay. So now you go and buy your new servers. Each server is going to come with 4 or 8 cores. That's almost default these days. Okay. So if you go and replace 10 servers, 10 old servers with 10 new servers, each of which has 8 cores, okay, now each server is going to be heavily underutilized, because the old application was barely needed 1 core to run. Now you are giving it 8 cores which it doesn't need at all. Okay. So what this should tell you is you can actually save some money by not having to buy 1 replacement server for 1 old server. Okay. You can buy a smaller number of new servers because they are more capable, okay, and make each server into several virtual servers, and on each virtual server you run whatever was running on your replaced server. Okay. This is referred to as server consolidation. You are consolidating a larger group of servers into a smaller number. Okay. So here's an example of consolidating 2 machines. So let's say you have 2 servers, each of which has 1 core. Okay, this is old server 1, old server 2. Okay. You go out and you buy a new replacement server which has, let's say, 2 cores. A very simple example. So what you would then do is you would run 1 VM here, 1 virtual machine here, okay, assign this core to this VM, assign this core to this VM, and then whatever was running here is going to run inside that virtual server, whatever is running here will be on that virtual server. Okay. So you replace 2 aging server with 1 new server. As an example. So this is another use of virtualization technologies in data centers. As you get more capable servers, you don't need to do one-to-one replacement. Okay, you can replace a larger number of servers with smaller numbers. Okay, so that is what is referred to as multi-core. So you can use it to do what is called server consolidation as well. Any questions on this? Yes.
So if the second server is
Second server is that one or the new
idle.
server?
Is idle, can the processing the first server be scheduled to run on the second server, on the second core?
Okay, so you are asking something that is very specific to resource management. The question is, since the new server has 2 cores, okay, if one of these virtual machines or its applications are idle, can the other virtual machine use both the cores? That's your question, right? Yeah. So that depends on how you have configured your virtual machines. Okay, so basically you will have a hypervisor running here. Okay. You can tell the hypervisor saying dedicate 1 core to each virtual machines. In this case, entire CPU core is dedicated to that virtual machine. Whether it uses it or not, it cannot be shared with other virtual machines. That's one way of configuring. That's called hard limits. Okay. Another way is basically to have sharing between cores. You can say that on an average, give it a core, but if the core is not utilized, you can use it for other virtual machines that might need it. Okay. You can configure your hypervisor to perform other kinds of resource management like this. If you did that, then what you said would actually happen when you're not dedicated or partitioning the cores, you're simply using different form of sharing. So if one core is idle, it can be used by other virtual machines. Okay, what actually happens is, inside this virtual machine, you have something called vCPUs, which are virtual CPUs. Okay. Virtual CPUs are mapped onto pCPUs, which are physical CPUs. Okay. How the mapping is performed depends on how you configure the virtual machine. You can have one-to-one mapping, many-to-one mapping, dedicated mapping, shared. So there is a wide range of how you can allocate physical resources to virtual resources. Okay. Depending on that, what you said may or may not actually happen. It depends on how those administrator has configured the virtual machines. Can you know questions?
In which category does VMware's ESXi fall under?
Okay, which category does ESX and ESXi fall? So ESX is a type 1 bare metal hypervisor. Okay? So it is basically going to be, go back a few slides. So it's going to be here. That's type 1. Okay, so it runs on bare metal. There's no kernel running. You just boot up the hypervisor. You don't boot an OS. Okay, and then you create virtual machines in there. Okay, so that is hardware level virtualization. Okay, that was just, as I initially said, you can even have virtualization at different layers. What we have covered so far is only one layer. We are simply virtualizing the hardware. Okay, what's next? So that is basically this. Okay, so you can have virtualization at each of these layers. So next we are going to talk about OS level virtualization, something you may or may not have encountered, but we'll talk about that next. Okay. So remember what is happening in OS level virtualization. You're using the OS's system call interface to emulate either a different interface or provide the same interface inside a virtual machine. Okay. Virtualization is just emulating one interface using another. Okay. So in this case, you're emulating the system call interface. With hardware level virtualization, you're emulating the instruction set and all the other devices on the machine itself. Okay. So now we are going to not emulate hardware anymore, we are simply emulating the system. Okay. So here is a picture, actually two different pictures to show you what is actually happening in OS level virtualization. So here is your hardware, that's your OS kernel. Okay, the OS kernel is going to provide the notion of a lightweight virtual machine, where inside each lightweight virtual machine you can emulate either the same system call interface that's emulated by the native OS or a slightly different system call interface, but there is not going to be OS running inside there. Okay, there's only one OS running. So what's going to run inside that lightweight virtual machine are directly applications that are going to use the functions of the underlying host kernel. Okay. So now you are at a different level of virtualization, you are at OS level virtualization. Okay, these lightweight virtual machines are now referred to as containers. Okay, they are not full-fledged virtual machines. You cannot boot up a OS kernel inside them because you are not emulating hardware, you are simply emulating the system call interface. You can run applications in them, but you can't run another kernel, unlike what you did in hardware level virtualization or type 1 or type 2 virtualization. Okay. We'll go into details of how this is going to work. There are many different OSs that support this. Okay, this was introduced about 15 years ago in Solaris through this notion of Solaris containers. There's a picture that I'm going to talk about that briefly. BSD introduced this notion of a jail. A jail is essentially a container where you have resource isolation and you have some notion of performance isolation as well. Okay, and then in the Linux world, you have Linux containers which have become very popular. I'm going to talk a little bit about Linux containers to give you some sense of how Linux implements OS level virtualization. Okay. So here's a picture of OS level virtualization in Solaris operating system. In Solaris, you have this notion of a zone. Okay. So by default, everything runs in a global zone. In a global zone, you have access to all the files on the machine, you have access to all the CPUs and so on. But you can construct more restricted zones. So here is zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and run an application inside that zone. When you run an application inside the zone, anything outside the zone is not visible to it. Okay? That means that this process cannot see this process or this other processes. Okay? You essentially get a more restricted view of what is happening on your machine. Okay? You may not see certain files, you may not see certain other processes. So you are limited to what you can actually see and what you can use on that machine. Okay, that's the notion of what a container will do for you. Then we'll talk about this in the context of Linux. Okay, but just first understand that this is virtualization at a different level of the software stack. We are talking about the OS level, okay, not hardware anymore. Any questions here? Yes?
This is similar to sandboxing?
This is similar to sandboxing. Containers are essentially sandboxing with a little more features. Okay? Even virtual machines, for that matter, are a sandbox. All virtualization is a sandbox, but you're sandboxing a process. You're not sandboxing an entire OS and all of its processes. Okay. So here is an example, not an example, but rather a picture that shows you OS level virtualization. Okay, so here is our picture, type 1 hypervisor. Okay. where you're running this hardware, you're running a hypervisor. Here there is a virtual machine. I don't know if this is visible, it's a little cluttered. Okay, here is VM1, here's VM2. Inside each VM, type 1. Type 2 hypervisor, you have hardware, you run a guest. Okay, inside, on top of the guest, you run another hypervisor, construct virtual machines, and inside each virtual machine, you run its own OS and application. In both of these cases, the virtual machine runs a full-fledged OS and applications. Okay, that's an important thing to keep in mind. So here there are two different virtual machines that are running two different kernels. Okay, same is true here. In fact, there are three kernels. There's the host kernel, the two guest kernels. Okay. This is a picture of OS level virtualization, where your hardware and there's an OS running. Okay. You construct a container. Inside the container, you can run application. You don't have to run another OS. Okay. The host OS provides all the functions to the application. Okay. But you're simply limiting what this application can see, what resources it can use. Okay. So you're providing some sandboxing, isolation, and so on. Okay. So as you can see, this is going to be a lot more lightweight than a full-fledged hardware level virtual machine. Okay. To construct a container, you don't have to install a whole new OS. Okay. Because you just share all the resources of the underlying OS. Okay. To boot up a container, you don't need to boot up an entire kernel. You simply need to set up the necessary sandbox and just start it, because the OS is already running. So this is going to be a lot more lightweight for us. Okay. So basically your fast provisioning, okay, it's lightweight and you get bare metal like performance because there's only one kernel. You don't have multiple kernels and more heavyweight operations here. So let's look at a little more details of how this is going to work. So you need, in order to implement OS level virtualization, you need support from the OS kernel. Essentially, you need 2 or 3 kinds of support. You need support for resource isolation to do the sandboxing. You need support for management of your containers. Okay? And essentially, I'll talk about 2 key features, okay, which will give us the desired properties to implement OS level virtualization, which is in the context of Linux, but the same ideas apply to any OS level virtualization. LXC stands for Linux containers. Okay, that's an acronym. It simply means Linux containers. So there are 2 techniques within Linux. One is called C groups or container groups that provide resource limits, priorities, accounting control. And the other one is namespaces, which provide process level isolation. And I'm going to talk about both of those in detail, a little more detail. There are other techniques like change, root, and so on, which I'm not going to talk about, or access control. Okay, but I will talk about tools that you use to manage Linux containers, such as Docker, okay, also. Okay, let's start with C groups. Okay, what's or container groups? So what do? They provide you resource isolation. What does that mean? It basically allows you to set limits on what resources each container can use and how much resources each container can use through a container group. Okay, so you can create a container and say, give it 20% of the CPU. Okay? So no matter what the application inside that container does, the underlying OS will not allow it to use more than 20% of the total CPU. Okay? You can say, give it 1 gigabyte of RAM. Okay? Even if you have 16 GB and the RAM is unutilized, if you limit that container to 1 GB, the OS will not allocate more than 1 GB to that process, no matter what else is happening on the machine. Okay? You can say, only allow it to access this part of my file system tree, for example. Okay, so then all other files on that disk, even though they are accessible to other processes, will not even be seen. Okay, this is how you are going to start sandboxing that application. You are going to limit what resources it can use. Okay, you can limit what. So here are some of these notions. So you can essentially say there's a technical CPU set. You can dedicate cores. If you have 4 cores, you can say this container only accesses this 1 core. Okay, that's a CPU set. Or you can do what was mentioned earlier, the same question had come up. You can say, or do what is called weighted proportional share. Okay? This is similar to what lottery scheduling does, if anybody remembers lottery scheduling from 3 or 4 classes ago. So I said you can assign lottery tickets or weights to each process, and you get CPU share in proportion to your weight for lottery tickets. Okay? So in weighted proportional share scheduling, you essentially, each process is given a weight and you get CPU share in proportion to the weight.
So if there are two processes or two containers that are each given weight of 1 or 1:1, each of them is going to get half the CPU share. Okay? If you basically give the first container 2 weight and the second container a weight of 1, this one is going to get 2/3 of the CPU, that's going to get, so this is going to get twice as much CPU as that, so that's essentially means you get 2/3 and 1/3 and so on. Okay? More generally, if there are n containers, okay, each of them is given a weight of Wi. Okay, a container is essentially going to get a fraction Wi over summation of Wj's. Okay, this is the total weights for all, and this is your weight. Okay, that's the fraction of that resource you are going to get. Okay. So C groups will allow you to assign a weight to each container, CPU weight. You can assign a weight also to your disk I/O. That will say what fraction of the disk bandwidth is going to get allocated. You can assign weights to the network interface card as well. If you have a gigabit Ethernet card, you give it a weight, you will be limited to that fraction. Okay, is that clear? So these are all OS level mechanisms that will allow you to limit how much CPU, disk, network, memory are you going to get. Okay? Here is a picture that will illustrate what happens when you share or don't share. So here there are 4 containers, there are 4 different colors. There's a blue, there's a green, there's a red, and there's a slightly different green. One is olive green, the other one is green. If you don't do anything, these are cores, these squares are cores, there are 16 cores here. You will see that each of these containers is simply running or taking some fraction of each of the core. Okay, so this square here shows this half of this core was used by the red container, a quarter was used by the green, and a quarter was used by the blue. Okay. If you look at this core here, you will see that the core is split equally amongst all 4 of those containers. All cores are being used by all containers in different fractions. If you do not set any resource limits, everybody gets whatever they use. Okay? Here is an example where you dedicated certain cores to certain containers. So you said, of my 16 cores, 3 cores go to the red container. Okay, so now that container is only running on those cores, it will never run on the other cores. You will say these 4 cores go to the blue containers. Okay, so you are essentially pinning containers to cores, and then the container will only run on those cores. Okay, this is one way by which you can now isolate your cores across containers that you have in your system. Okay. So this is one OS level mechanism. This allows you to specify resource limits. So essentially, it's controlling what resources can be used and how much of those resources can each container use. The first technique that you need to implement containers. Okay, is that clear? Any questions here? I didn't tell you how to implement it. I just said what is implemented. Okay, you have to actually go into the kernel and implement features to do some of these things. Okay, change the CPU scheduler, change the disk scheduler. So all the scheduling mechanisms inside the kernel have to be modified in order to implement these features. And that I did not tell you how that is done. Simply showing you what is done. Okay. The second key feature is what is called namespaces. This is restricting what a container can see. Okay. The first case we basically restricted what you can actually use, what hardware resources. Here you are going to restrict what a container can see. What does that mean? So if you have 10 processes running, one of the processes inside a container, it cannot see the other 9 processes. It will look like to this process that it's the only process in the system. Inside the container, if you do PS or top or any of these things, you don't see the presence of other processes. Okay? So this process cannot send a message to these other processes, it cannot see those other processes, it cannot do anything. Okay? So now you are essentially implementing sandbox by limiting what you can actually even see from a process's perspective. Okay? You can do the same thing across all resources. Okay? Processes might have the illusion that there are only processes on the system. Inside a container, you don't see processes that are in other containers or running globally, not in any container. Okay? You can do the same thing in the file system level. You can mount certain directories, and then those processes cannot even see the global file system anymore. You cannot see other directories in the file system. Okay? You cannot Same thing you can do with network interface card. If you have multiple NICs, you may actually say this process or this container can only access this network interface card. Can only use Wi-Fi but not Ethernet. Okay, you can do these things. Okay. You can also limit what users you can actually see. If there are 20 user accounts, you can say this container only sees these 3 user accounts. Okay, so now if you actually try to look for other users inside those containers, the presence of other users will not be visible. Okay, so this way you can construct a container for a certain user and say that's your container, but that user will not actually see any other users. Neither can other users access that container because they will not be recognized as valid users inside that containers. Okay, so you can take your user accounts on your machine and partition it across containers as well. Okay. So now you have implemented sandboxing at a resource usage level. You also implemented sandboxing using this notion of namespace and restricted what a container can see. Okay, together you are going to get some level of isolation. Okay, because you may not be able to see certain things, you may not be able to use certain things. Okay. This is lightweight virtualization. If you do this, you get some similar techniques to what hardware level virtualization is, but you don't need to run your own OS and whatnot. Okay, this is going to be very lightweight. So here is a picture, again it doesn't seem to be visible at all. It's much better in the slide. So here are 3 namespaces. Yeah, I mean, if you actually look at this when you print it out, you'll see in the blue namespace you can see certain files. Here you can see certain other files and so on. You've taken your file system and said this container can only see these directories, / user / bin. This container can see some other directories but not these directories. They can overlap of course, but they don't have to. Okay, so you're limiting that here. These are the list of processes. Here is the list of processes. So if there are 100 processes within this container, 10 processes run. They don't see the other 90 in other containers. So that's basically what that is showing. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. So this is all good. So I said it's faster. It can be more agile and whatnot. What might be some downsides to OS level virtualization that you don't have in hardware level virtualization? Is there any downside at all, or is it all good? Everything is better, nothing is worse. Go back to the picture. So this is hardware level. This is OS level virtualization. Yes.
So can we run applications in a specific operating system? We cannot run applications in different operating systems.
Okay. First downside is here you are limited by the operating system. Okay. Here, if you had hardware level virtualization, you could run Windows in one and Linux in the other. You run Windows app in the first VM, Linux app in the other VM, or you could run, I showed you Linux running on top of OS X and so on. So multiple operating system platforms can be supported on one machine. Here you are limited by whatever is the OS, the guest host OS. That is Linux containers. You can only run Linux and you can't certainly start running OS X apps. Okay, that's the first limitation. Yes. Anything else? There are other limitations. Okay, you are limited by the OS platform. You can't run other OS or the applications here. Okay, think about resource isolation. Okay, virtual machines are a much more stronger form of isolation and protection than what you have in containers. Okay. Here Linux, if you run Linux and Windows, Linux can never see what's happening in Windows. It doesn't know the present. That's a completely different emulated virtual machine. Okay. Much stronger isolation. In this case, the isolation is weaker. You are running on the same OS kernel. Okay. Depending on how you set your Linux container groups, you may or may not see isolation. It's up to the system administrator to decide how much sandboxing they want to do. Okay, that's a configuration matter. If you don't implement sandboxing, all containers will run and share all resources, see everything. Okay. So it's up to the system administrator to decide how much of a wall to erect between containers. You can try to make it strict or you can make it very loose. Okay. If you make it very loose, there is more flexible sharing of resources. Okay. but there is also more interference. If one container starts running heavy duty applications, other containers may get less CPU time if you did not put a strong isolation. Or you start allocating lot of RAM, you may start hogging the RAM and impact the performance of other containers. Just as if you have two processes running on the native OS, one process suddenly takes over and just start doing a lot of computation, other processes see their impact. Same is true here. If you don't implement isolation mechanism, they are there, the knobs are there, but depends on how you configure them. And you may get loose or strong forms of isolation. Okay? The same is true from a security standpoint. If one container exploits, because there's only one kernel running here, if you do something that brings down the kernel, you trigger a bug, or so you can attack the OS and you have some backdoor and you take over the OS and you bring it down, all containers are impacted by this. Okay? So the isolation is less strict. In this case, if an application brings down the kernel on the virtual machine, other VMs are not impacted because they are running their own independent kernels. Okay? Now, why is this important? This is important if you are running untrusted applications inside containers, which often happens in a cloud computing environment. A cloud computing environment, unknown customers come to you and say, I need a virtual machine, I want to run my application. You don't know who this person is, what application they're going to run, what might happen. Okay? If they do something bad, okay, and that brings down, in this case, okay, their own OS, other customers are not impacted. If you run your customers on containers, one customer does something inadvertent and brings down the OS, all other customers running on that machine are impacted, not other machine, but that machine. Okay, so when you are running untrusted third-party application, the more isolation, the more performance isolation you have, the better off you are, which you will not get it. Now, if it's the same user who wants to simply run different applications, that's a different matter. That's a more trusted environment. So, where you use Linux container actually matters, because you are not going to get the same level of security or performance isolation as you may get in hardware level virtualization. But the benefits are everything is more lightweight, there's less overheads and whatnot. Okay? Any questions on this? So we'll continue and we talked about namespaces, and then this is simply a picture that shows it all, which I'll ignore because I already mentioned namespaces and containers and C groups and whatnot. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about Docker. Okay, so essentially, containers use a set of OS level mechanisms. Okay, you get container groups, you get namespaces and so on. That by itself doesn't give you virtual machine technology. Because to implement virtual machines, you need a way to manage your virtual disks, you need images, you need to manage images, you need to package them and so on. Okay? So essentially OS, Linux's kernel has implemented this. That doesn't mean now I have everything I need to construct a virtual machine, lightweight virtual machine or a container. I need other tools that will allow me to create images, download images, install images, configure the container by installing the right set of protections and so on. So any container technology will come with its own set of tools which will allow you to configure, manage images, resource usage on the machine when you boot up a container and so on. Okay? And even in the Linux world, there are a set of these tools available. I have named bunch of them. That should be Virtuoso, not Virtuoso, OpenZ, the vServers, LXC tools, Warden, and Docker. So there's a set of these tools. People have implemented various tools. You can use any of them. Okay? For some reason, Docker has become very popular among those tools, and everybody is looking at Linux containers, managing Linux containers using Docker. Okay? Docker is just a set of user level tools that allows you to manage Linux containers. So what kinds of things does it do? It makes container deployment portable. Okay? Essentially, a Docker container is not just the application code and libraries, it's a set of config files that if you just install, it will configure the right set of resource sandboxing on that machine, and it will ensure that the OS knows about the application and so on, and it just runs. Yeah, otherwise, to make a container, you would have to get the code for the application, construct a C group. Inside the C group, you have to say this much CPU, this much RAM. All of these settings have to be set for you to actually use the container. Here, everything has been packaged for you. You just download it, the right configuration files get installed, you boot it, and everything is done. So it is much more convenient. It is portable. It's written in a way that any Linux kernel that supports Linux containers can then take that Docker and run it. You don't need to go and reconfigure everything. Okay, just as you could take a virtual disk, okay, or a virtual machine appliance, download it and run, Docker does the same thing in the Linux container world. Okay? So it implements portability. Okay? This is often now being used in source code development environment. Okay? So your source code developer, software developer, you build your software application. Okay? You can put it in a Docker container and give it to the testing team. Okay? So here it's a container, just run it and test it. Okay? Or vice versa, the testing team finds a bug. Okay? Rather than telling you I had this use case, I did this, and then this bug got triggered, you just have the bug in a container, the test case running in a container, you just give it back to the developer saying just run this container, the test will see the bug. Okay, so it's actually used for software development. It also eases taking code and then deploying it in production. Everything is configured, so you just put it in a container, you move it to the right server and you run it. Okay, so these are all things that are being used for fast software development life cycle, from writing code to testing to deploying it in production system. Okay, that's one use case of where these techniques are being used as well. Okay, it allows you to do automatic builds. Okay, just as you can run make or ant or whatever and then compile everything, you can take the application and you can run a batch job to build file, and it will build not only the application but encapsulate it into a container that you can just go and deploy. You don't need to reinstall the version. So and then there are reuse and what. I'm going to show you some more things here on Docker. So here is basically, so this is type 1 hypervisors. This is Linux containers. I showed you that picture before. This is essentially Linux container with Docker. So it's basically a layer that allows you to manage these containers, create them, remove them, have applications packaged in them. All of that becomes very easy. It's portable. Can construct a container on one machine, give it to someone, they can run it on their machine. They don't need to go and configure all the OS files on their machine in order to run the container. Okay, is that clear? So now I'll talk a little bit about how some of these things works. That picture again looks very cluttered, but I'll talk about what. So first I said it's portable. Okay, Docker images will run anywhere with Docker. But more importantly, the way Docker actually makes it portable is that it has added a small layer of virtualization on top of Linux containers themselves. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me give you an example. Okay, so let's say this is a Linux machine, it's running Linux. Okay, let's just take one resource. I'm going to take the Ethernet card. Okay, this is the network interface card on the machine, okay, which has its own IP address. Okay, so let's say I make a container here. Okay, so one way I could configure this container is to say, take this Ethernet card and give this machine some fraction of the interface bandwidth. If there is a gigabit Ethernet, it gets 30% of the gigabit speed on that.